Welcome to SBC members today, to major company group members, Export New Zealand members, and then members of government agencies who are joining us today as well, which is really fantastic. Great to have you here, and then our other special guests. So welcome today. A special welcome and thank you to John Manhire from Agribusiness Group and the New Zealand Sustainability Dashboard for making Jason's visit possible. It's fantastic to have you in the country, Jason. And thank you also to Morgan Williams from WWF New Zealand. He has been absolutely essential to this, and Jason tells me he's been to every single one of these events so far, so Morgan will be able to speak for Jason, I imagine, at some point in the future. He can already do it. Okay, well, that's great. It's a great stand-in. And also, and by no means least obviously, welcome to Jason, who is going to be talking to us today. Now, Jason and I had a brief conversation about how long an introduction to him should be, and he said keep it very short. And we sent a bio out with the invitation. So I'm going to introduce Jason by saying that in today's world, you judge the credibility of a speaker based on whether or not they have a TED Talk. And it is true that Jason has 5 and that they are excellent and compelling. And so Jason is going to be talking to us a bit today about things which are happening in the international scene, things he's trying very hard to influence, what that's going to mean for us as exporters, what that's going to mean for us as food manufacturers, what it's going to mean for us as businesses. And so the opportunity today is to really hear about some of the things which are going to shape the future of our industries and our markets.
So there's good news and bad news about the TED Talks. I've actually given 12 of them, but only 5 have been posted. So there you have it. I want to just give a little bit of background information about my own work with companies and how that came to be, because I think it sets the stage for how my learning journey has occurred and what I'm thinking about and working on now. And quite frankly, I was a skeptical human rights advocate at the time, not even an environmentalist at that point. Very concerned about the practices of business and the practice of business as it relates to Indigenous people around the world. And the Grateful Dead did a benefit concert to save the rainforest. And at that concert, I met a guy named Ben, who ended up being Ben from Ben & Jerry's, and he wanted to know what he could do to help save the rainforest. So we concocted the idea of making an ice cream called Rainforest Crunch. And I set up a little trading company to buy and sell nuts from Indigenous people. And it went along pretty well. We found that there was a 40% waste in shipping the nuts from the source in the forest all the way to the processing plants. So we set up shelling plants much closer, and we were able to use that 40% to really capitalize our operation. We got the percentage of waste down to 5. We used long-term contracts, so I would guarantee to buy products from the local groups, and they could take those contracts to banks and borrow money, all their working capital. These are things that today are still novel, that aren't quite done, and this was 30 years ago. We raised the price to producers by 3 times because of reducing the waste. Now, 3 times 1% of the export value. They were getting 1% when we started, so they were getting 3%. When we finished. And that is the nature of the beast for primary production. Producers get very little of the final food dollar. But because we were so active in public, every other buyer of Brazil nuts doubled the price they were paying to collectors. So for the first time, an eco-label actually had the power to double the entire price of a commodity. We also signed contracts with each of our 50 different corporate partners that they would pay a 5% environmental premium on the cost, the imported cost of those nuts, and that would be used to set up shelling plants and expand the business on the ground. And they would also enter into some form of profit sharing. And we didn't make any stipulations as to what it should be, but it should be something that they could talk about. So it had to be significant enough that it was credible. And some did it by unit, some did it by value, some did it by weight, some did it by other things. It came on average to about 1%. So at the end, we were working with 50 companies with 200 products in the market, about 100 million in sales per year. And we proved that forests could be 6 times more valuable than the same area converted to pasture and used for cattle. And we thought, wow, we've kind of done it. This is it. And we failed. And we failed because The people who were growing cattle and the government that was subsidizing cattle didn't care about Brazil nuts. And they didn't care about that employment and that income. What they cared about was a larger tax base with a larger group of people, et cetera. So fast forward about 15 years to WWF, where we started trying to figure out how to work on the biggest threats to the places we care about. We'd identified 35 places in the world that were the most important, 15 commodities that were the biggest threats to those 35 places, and the 300 to 500 companies that were the biggest buyers of those 15 commodities. But as we started doing the list of the 300 to 500 companies, we saw the same companies in all the different lists. Or not all of them, but 100 companies actually touched 25% of the production of all 15 of the commodities. And so we developed a strategy, we called it market transformation, where our goal was by 2020 to get those 100 companies and that 25% of market share to shift towards certified sustainable production. And as of today, 10 of the 15 have reached 25%. We have partnerships with 70 of those companies. Other NGOs work with another 20 of them, and I would say 10 are probably troglodytes that are never going to work with anybody about anything. But still, we've actually been able to achieve that goal. But we're not quite getting the uptake that we want and the push that we want, or rather the pull that we want. And so on the one hand, we need to work with the next 10,000 companies to really make this significant. And we also need to move the bottom. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. But I think where we're headed as an NGO, and I think we all have to reinvent ourselves periodically, but especially as times change, are the solutions that we're offering, are the tools that we're using, are they fit for purpose in the 21st century? NGOs don't buy and sell anything, and they don't make laws and regulations. So how do they influence? How can they shift from doing projects to actually influencing actions of others and bigger institutions on the ground? So we've come to realize as an NGO, our mission is still the same. It's biodiversity conservation, it's ecosystem services, it's protected areas, it's biological corridors, it's all those things that made us the logo and the name that you all know. But if we don't get where and how we produce food right, we can turn out the light and go home. There will be no biodiversity in the next 35 years because agricultural sprawl is the biggest threat to the planet. So I want to talk about that today and what is happening, what some companies are doing about it. I mentioned I spent part of my time in human rights, and I did a lot of work with refugees and famine victims. And I was asking an Ethiopian refugee why it is that the world didn't understand that famines are man-made. They're not created by the weather, they're created by policies and politics and often by militaries. And he said, you can't wake a person who's pretending to sleep. I think that's where we are today. We're in a world where there's a lot of things happening around us. We know they're there, and we ignore them. We'll put it off till tomorrow, or we'll put it off for somebody else. We've got to wake up. We have a situation where I think change, both the speed and scale of change, is happening much faster than anybody has been aware of, and certainly much faster than institutions are responding. And that's going to need to change. China illustrates it probably better than anybody. So it took the UK with 9 million people 155 years to double GDP. It took the US 53 years with 10 million people. It took China 12 years with 1 billion. It took India 17 years with 822 million. That's the speed of change today. And what happened in China is that the doubling GDP happened in 95, by the end of 95. It took 10 years before people trusted that system, the new wealth, to be there. And then they started spending money. And then that started hitting commodity markets. And we started seeing prices go up. But we also started seeing food shortages because of prices going up. And so these yellow dots, 23 of them, represent a food riot where somebody was killed. And rising prices and social instability are huge and an issue that for the next 35 years we're going to be having to address at a global scale. Food security is national security, but food security isn't local self-sufficiency. That is a nonsense. As soon as New Zealand figures out how to produce cocoa and coffee and all the different things that you consume for breakfast, then we can start talking about food self-sufficiency as a strategy. But I think trade is really important from a global perspective. Put another way, this is our challenge. So by 2050, we're going to have to produce as much food, say in the next 40 years, as we have in the last 8,000. We're already having impacts from food production and other land uses that exceed the carrying capacity or the regenerative capacity of the planet. This is the challenge for the 21st century. Food production is the biggest threat on the planet. It's the largest source of habitat loss. 70% of biodiversity loss in terrestrial areas is related to food production. 70%. We use 70% of all the fresh water used by people to produce food. Are we going to double that? 140%? Where's it going to come from? We use more chemicals for food production than any other human activity. We produce more pollution from food production than any other human activity. Greenhouse gases, climate change, all in, depending on your science, are 25 to 35%, the largest single contributor, if you include land use change, all those things, in addition to rice and methane and dairy and beef. And then there is that little issue of topsoil. We've lost half the topsoil in the last 150 years on the planet. And at least half of farmed land today is degraded by some definition. Probably a group of scientists would put the figure a bit higher. So we can't really get away from this equation, that population times consumption mitigated to some extent by technology. That's how we've always been able to expand populations and things, but it's got to equal the carrying capacity of the planet, and today it doesn't. We're at about 1.5 planets today. Look at this a slightly different way. Today we have 7 billion people, and each of them consumes one, on average, unit of consumption. That's 7 billion units of consumption. By 2050, we're going to have at least 9 billion people. Probably 9.6 is what the data is telling us today. They're going to have 2.9 times as much income per capita, and they're going to consume twice as much because they're going to consume up the food chain, more animal protein, et cetera. That means 18 billion units of consumption. Not just doubling of 7, but actually 18. If we're going to produce all of that food with no more footprint than we have today, and ideally even less than we have today, then each unit of this consumption was going to take 60 to 70% less inputs. That's what the efficiency levels, the continuous improvement we need to achieve by 2050. So we measure absolute impacts at a planetary level, not just per capita or per unit impacts at a farm or a production level. We've got to start managing the planet. We've got to start collecting data at a planetary level. This is the home that we all live on. It's all interconnected. So how do we freeze the footprint of food? I think here the issue isn't what to think. There's no blueprint. It's never been done before. We've never been in this place before. The issue isn't what to think, it's how to think. What is important? How do we think sideways, not just forwards? So trade is going to be key. And I think what we're seeing globally is an increasing isolationism, increasing anti-trade, a lot of concern about this, and yet trade has probably got to be a pillar of how you manage a planet sustainably. It probably will never dominate food. Trade in the last 15 years has doubled as a percentage of food production. Traded food, it's up from 6% to about 15%. 15% is still pretty small, but trade is essential for filling the gaps. It's essential for filling in places where we have gaps from drought, from extreme weather issues, from political conflict, etc. Trade is important. But why are we exporting so much cereal and grains around the world as feed rather than exporting animal protein? If we export animal protein from the places where we can produce the feed, then we can have closed loop systems and reintroduce that back into the soil. Whereas if you export grain to China, you produce pollution and you produce half the red tides in the world in the marine area. And you affect coastal aquaculture, and you take $1 billion worth of production off the market each year. So we've got to start understanding the connections between what we're doing and what would be more sustainable. Most of the subsidies today are for business as usual. And most subsidies today are from government institutions paying farmers to do what they've always done. That's not the way to manage a planet. That's certainly not the way to support innovation. To get innovation, and I think subsidies are fantastic for innovation, but subsidies shouldn't be for things that are ongoing and that have already been done. But we've got to make that pivot. And just in the last 10 years, the role of subsidies and who is subsidizing has actually shifted substantially. And it's going to be shifting again, but China's subsidies are twice the US and Europe combined. India's are equal to the US and Europe combined. Brazil is 3 times the US. We've got to start looking at these subsidies and figuring out ways to pivot them to more meaningful investments, about conservation easements, about rehabilitation of degraded land, about doing things that take pressure off of resource rather than just keep business as usual. Business as usual is not going to get us where we need to go. Part of the issue is the price of food. The price of food doesn't include the cost of producing food. There are too many externalities. In fact, if you want to look at it that way, the biggest source of subsidies today is the planet itself. The planet is subsidizing our food production at many-fold more important scale than governments. That's the soil erosion that the planet is taking care of. That's the air pollution, the water pollution, et cetera, that the planet is absorbing. Food is cheap, is probably too cheap, and yet 1 billion at least people can't afford food today, and in some countries people will spend 80% of their income on food and still go hungry. About 800 million people are malnourished. More than 100 million children are stunted. This is today when we actually have enough to feed everybody. Imagine what this will look like when we don't. And here's the dirty little secret. Probably half of farmers can't feed their own families. If you look at the data, malnourishment and stunting are in rural areas, not in cities, across the world. We've never really addressed that issue. So do we actually want policies and programs to keep small farmers, to keep them in this condition, to certify poverty, if you will? We got to think about it. So if we double food availability by 2050, how are we going to do that? We've decided that you need to focus on productivity and efficiency on the one hand, and reducing food waste and loss and changing consumption patterns on the other. None of these strategies will get you there by itself. All of them combined will easily get us where we need to go. Not necessarily easily, but adequately get us where we need to go. But here's a question. Should we leave sustainability to consumer choice? Should consumers have the choice to buy unsustainable products? If we want the planet to be more sustainable, every product on the shelf should be sustainable. Consumers don't have the time or the expertise in 3 to 5 seconds that they use to make a choice as to whether that product is sustainable or not. But the other question is, why are unsustainable products cheaper? They actually cost the planet much more. They cost all of us in terms of government and how we have to clean up the mess of unsustainable production. We need to get our arms around this. It doesn't mean consumers shouldn't be informed. It doesn't mean consumers don't need to know more about their food system, be involved more in their food system. But I think they need to be informed as much as voters as consumers. Because a lot of this is about politics. A lot of this is about changing policies. So let's look at food waste. We waste 1 in 3 calories today. If you look at that, that means that for every 2 we consume, 1 is wasted. So the waste is 50% of what we're currently consuming. If we need to double food production for consumption needs, then waste is 50% of the new food. So it's a huge part of any strategy to get us to 2050 without using more resources. We've already got it. We just wouldn't waste it. But waste is a lot more interesting than that. And that's why it's, I think, the low-hanging fruit of all of these strategies. If we use 70% of all the water on the planet to produce fresh water that's used by humans to produce food, then a third of that 70% is 23%. It means we use 23% of all the water on the planet to produce food waste. Think about it. If food is 30% on average of greenhouse gas emissions, and food waste is 10%, or excuse me, a third of all food, then 10% of greenhouse gas emissions is for producing food waste. It's the easiest thing that we could do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, is just get rid of food waste. So let's have a target. We've set up one of a 50% reduction by 2025. We don't think we can eliminate food waste, but we can cut it in half. And we can probably even go further, but we don't want to make food waste reduction a choice. We want to institutionalize it. We want to make it hard to waste food at an institutional level, not just at a human choice level. We're concerned about the expansion of food production into areas we care about: natural habitat, wetlands, grasslands, forest, etc. We can turn the agricultural frontier on itself by rehabilitating land that's been degraded, that's already been used for production, sometimes abandoned, sometimes just used for inefficient kind of production of pasture, etc. We can rebuild those soils. We've set a target with the World Bank of 250 million hectares by 2030. Brazil has already achieved 15 million hectares and has a target of 25 million more by 2030. So we can begin to do these kinds of things. We know that if you increase soil organic matter, you reduce pesticide use, you reduce fertilizer use, you reduce fungicide use, you reduce water use, and you increase the value of the land. You increase the assets of the producers. Very important. It's not a 5% increase in income. It's not a 5% increase in production. It's a 50% increase in the value of your property. So I mentioned this figure about 70% of the water, but this is what it comes to. Today, 1 liter of water produces 1 calorie of food on average. By 2050, we should be able to produce 2 calories of food with half a liter of water. That's the kind of change we need to see going forward. Without genetics, we'd be hunters and gatherers. Genetics are what allowed agriculture and livestock production to occur: plant breeding, animal husbandry, etc. So it's not a question of if genetics, it's a question of which genetics and what countries are going to allow. But we have got to use 21st century genetics to bring productivity up, to bring efficiency up, to reduce stress on plants, to make plants more tolerant of drought and disease. Look at it another way. Most of the money spent on research from plant genetics is focused on corn and soybeans, and a little bit on wheat and rice, but mostly corn and soybeans. That's how many calories corn and soybeans produce. Bananas, without all of the brouhaha and without the investment in the research, already produce 20 times more calories per hectare than corn in the Midwest, in the most productive parts of the United States. But sugar produces 3 times more calories than bananas do, 60 times more than corn. So as we're thinking about where we're going to get our calories, now nutrients are the bigger issue, but can we add nutrients to sugar? Instead of producing 100% more corn, which would get us 10% of bananas, can we actually add more nutrients to sugar or bananas so that we actually have more production of nutrients and calories for people? And maybe while we're at it, can we look at the crops that people actually eat in the places in the world where we're going to have more population and more consumption? Crops like these. Can we map the genomes of these products, put it in the public domain, and train plant breeders how to do marker-assisted breeding? These crops, for the most part, have never benefited from 20th century, much less 21st century plant breeding. We could triple, quadruple the production of these crops in Africa in the subcontinent of Asia. That's where we're going to have the biggest population increases, the biggest income increases, the biggest consumption increases. We need to focus on these kind of things. WF has identified with Mars, with the Beijing Genomic Institute and NEPAD in Africa, the 100 most important food crops, and we're halfway through mapping the genomes of all of them. We're training 30 plant breeders in Africa a year to actually do marker-assisted breeding and providing them with the equipment to do that. We've just been asked by the Tata Foundation to do the same thing in South Asia. All of the information goes in the public domain. Nobody can own it. Nobody can patent it. The goal of this work is to get plant breeders to provide planting materials that are of quality to farmers, not to own IP. Better practices, 100 times better than worse practices, right? So which is going to give us more food going forward? Is it recognizing the best producers, which is what certification does, or is it moving the rest of the producers? Is it moving the entire performance curve? And what we've come to realize is that the certification programs that we've helped create 20 or so of have really identified what the key impacts are, what performance is possible, and what innovative things are happening with producers to achieve it. But rewarding the people who are already better doesn't really move the bottom. And the private sector demand is maybe going to pull up to 50% of production, but it's not going to move the bottom. And here's the rub. The bottom 25% by efficiency, by productivity of producers for any commodity produce 50% of the impacts and 10% of the product. So if we want to reduce impacts and we want to increase productivity globally, we focus on the bottom 25%, not the top. And companies can't do this. Governments have got to be engaged on this. NGOs can also be engaged on this. But it means we have to shift to work with the worst performers. That's a very uncomfortable thing for many NGOs. And yet that's where the biggest payoff is. Either those producers need to get better or need to start producing something else or finding another way to make a living, because those kind of impacts are just not tolerable if we're going to have to double production across the planet. Another thing we need to think about is commodity and commodity trading. So commodities, a little history lesson here. Commodities were created as a formal concept, not trade, but commodities, about 175 years ago. And it's no accident that commodities were created as a concept about 10 years after interchangeable parts were invented, because commodities are actually interchangeable products. 1 ton of sugar equals 1 ton of sugar produced anywhere in the world. And you use these physical specs to actually guarantee it. So if you're a buyer, you buy a ton of X, you know it's going to be that, whether it comes from Brazil or India or China or wherever. Well, guess what? To do that, a bag of wheat in 1800 went from the farmer directly to the mill in the same bag. It never changed, never got mixed with other wheat. Today, it all gets mixed up. So today, the efficiency of the system is that we lose all the information that would have been in the system. So today, we don't know who produced the product. We don't know where it came from, how it was produced, what the impacts of production were. And guess what? Today, that's exactly what we want to know. Who produced the product? Did they use slave labor? Did they use child labor? Did they have the right concessions to the land? It has nothing to do with the fiscal attributes of the product, but it has everything to do with risk for the buyer. So we have got to figure out how to take the efficiency of globally traded commodities and add this other layer of information to it without losing that efficiency. Because we can't afford to lose efficiency in global trade. That's for sure, but we've got to add all of, not just these things, but literally traceability. From a risk point of view, companies have to be able to know where their product's coming from. And if there's a problem, where it came from, so they can either fix it or not buy from that source anymore. And then there's the issue of animal protein. Every country that gets wealthier increases per capita consumption of animal protein. That's not likely to change. In fact, the projections for India are that it already consumes 25% of the world's eggs. By 2030, 2040, it's going to be 40% of the world's eggs, because that's a form of animal protein that Indians will eat. This is the poster child, if you will, of inefficiency. Today we use 60% of all the land used to produce food just for beef, and that doesn't include feed. That's just pasture. And it produces 1.3% of calories. Now it's more nutrients than that because animal proteins have more nutrients. So it's probably, let's say, 3 to 4% of the nutrients that people consume. But going forward, the question is going to be, can we use better grasses? Can we manage pasture better? On 30% of the land, can we produce 3% of the calories and maybe 7% of the nutrients that we need? That's the kind of efficiency we need to see happening. And there's only one place where historically it's happened, and that's with poultry. So poultry has achieved, remember I said we have to reduce by 60% or improve by 60% the efficiency of how we produce? Well, poultry's done that. They've done it not through one thing, but they've done it by reducing the amount of feed it takes to produce an animal. And that's been reinforced by reducing the mortality rates. And that's been reinforced by getting the animal to market faster, so you actually have to feed them less because they're growing more quickly. And that's been reinforced by their weight, so that you actually have more product at the end of the day. That's all just looking at how you do something efficiently. Now, here's the question. Where's the water? How much water does it take? Where's the medications? How much medications are involved? Where's the animal welfare? How much space is involved? You could never do this today. In fact, most of the things that consumers want will make this less efficient, at least in the short term, until we figure out how to do it again. And that's a challenge, because we've got to figure out how to balance off what the perceived needs are versus some other needs of other consumers. But I think the biggest takeaway of poultry is that we can't afford to maximize just one variable. We've got to optimize several. So we can't just look at feed conversion. We can't just look at space. We can't just look at any one pet issue. We've got to figure out an index that allows us to take 4 or 5 key indicators, some of which are contradictory. You push one up, the other goes down. We've got to take that into account. That's smart. We've got to understand those relationships. And then there's the big unknown, is what's the impact of climate change, extreme weather, and weather variability going to be on food? Let me just look at something that you probably all eat. Cocoa, chocolate. So this is where these two countries in West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, they produce 70% of the world's cocoa. The green parts are where it's very, very good production or excellent, right? 14 years from now, this is where the scientists say is going to be very good or excellent. It's 10% of what it is today. So either production is going to decline a lot, and that will come in the form of diseases and pests and things that, rather than just absolute, killing of trees, it's going to be a slow death, as it were. In the short term, climate-smart agriculture for cocoa producers or for corn or soy or cotton or anything is going to become more efficient, to try to do more with less, just to tread water, just stay where you were. But in the medium to long term, and by that I mean 6 to 10 years, not a long time, 6 to 10 years, it means you're either going to change your crops because they're no longer as suitable as they need to be, or you're going to change genetics to things that are more drought tolerant, more productive, more disease resistant, etc. And that means we need the ability to do plant breeding in shorter periods of time. Imagine trying to do plant breeding for trees in 10 years, using hit or miss genetic tools. We have got to be able to do marker-assisted breeding. Take snippets of DNA from the cocoa trees that are more drought tolerant, more disease resistant, and express them through cocoa. That's marker-assisted breeding. That's what we need to be doing. Take hybrids and do the same kinds of things. It doesn't mean genetic modification. Well, technically taking DNA even from the same plant is genetic modification, but it doesn't mean transgenics necessarily. That's going to be, every country is going to decide what they want to do about that, but we cannot take genetics off the table as part of our response to climate change. So Mars has made a commitment that they want to really, they won't buy certified poverty because they found that the fair trade, organic, OOTS, and Rainforest Alliance certified cocoa that they were buying, the producers' children were just as likely to be stunted or malnourished as the non-certified producers. And they said, forget that. If this is about improving the lot of families, this is not doing it, so we're going to go our own road. So they looked at plantations of cocoa. They found the 20% of trees that produce 80% of the crops, and they mapped the genome of those trees. And they have started to select traits. They put all this in the public domain so any other plant breeders can get access to it that want. And now, on about 30% of the land, they can produce 3 times as much cocoa, freeing up other land for other crops. And Mars was a partner on the orphan crops research because they want this land to be used to produce traditional food crops, but much more productive than just the traditional varieties. So rehabilitating cocoa is really going to be about keeping cocoa replanting out of places like national parks. Today, most people don't realize that 70% of the illegal deforestation in Côte d'Ivoire is from planting cocoa. 12% of cocoa production in Côte d'Ivoire comes from inside national parks. Now that 12% translates, because of their position in global production, to 5% of global production of cocoa is produced inside national parks. That means 1 M&M in every bag is from a national park. Think about it that way. Child labor. 1 of every 3 laborers in Côte d'Ivoire is a child. And they're applying chemicals without protection. They're doing all kinds of work. The government needs to enforce its own laws, and it's not. But we need the private sector also to step up with long-term contracts that allow producers to invest in new plantings, and the government to allow grafting to occur so you can actually graft saplings and get better production, new on new, immediately. In 18 months, you can actually start producing cocoa. In 2.5 years, you can produce as much cocoa on the new plants as the entire old trees did, because you're taking advantage of 30-year-old roots to provide the nutrients in the water for new stalks of cocoa. But we've got to think differently about this. Unilever has made a commitment as a company that 100% of all their products will be certified as sustainable by 2020, and they're not going to make it. I just spoke with them on Sunday. Now they're trying to figure out what to do about that. Do they back off it entirely? Or do they say this is aspirational, come clean with what they've done and what they've been able to do and what they haven't been able to do, and simply throw it out to the public? And my advice was the latter, that it's important to have big goals. It's important to achieve 70 or 80% of them. It's better to have those kind of goals and that kind of success than to take a 50% goal and actually make it. 50% people will just say, what about the other 50%? You just took the easy part. So I think they're going to move forward, and they have certainly been an example for a lot of other companies. But IKEA has done the same thing around cotton. Now, you may not realize this, but after Walmart, IKEA buys more cotton than any other company in the world. It's because of all the towels and sheets and stuffing and carpets and things that are made of cotton that they sell in their stores. They started working with us to develop cotton standards, and they now have influenced 15% of global cotton production. Those producers use 50% less water, 40% less pesticides, and 30% less fertilizers. And they're actually making 15% more money because they're more efficient. So that's what some of these companies are doing in relationship to their own supply chains. And then you have producers, like in the Global Salmon Initiative, where 17 of the world's largest salmon aquaculture production companies have all agreed to work together, and those 17 companies represent 70% of global production. They're sharing all their information about how to reduce impacts, what the costs are, what the payback period is, what the return on investment is, and also what doesn't work, And this is all in the public domain. It's aggregated, and anybody can go onto Global Salmon Initiative website and find out where they stand in terms of escapes, in terms of feed, in terms of lice treatment, etc. What are the trends that are happening? And then there's the Consumer Goods Forum, which has 400 global members, $3+ trillion of sales a year, and they take on specific issues. Recently, they decided that they were going to take deforestation out of their supply chains. So they focused on 4 products from 2 countries, which is 50% of global deforestation. Now, this sounds like a pretty simple thing, right? The first thing that you have to do is define what a forest is. The second thing you have to do is to define what deforestation is. These are not simple things. There are all kinds of forest around the world, and how much of a forest can be cut before it's actually deforestation. All of these things, they're not equipped to do that, so they have to find partners. But they sent a signal through the marketplace that they were interested in doing this. Within 2 years of that signal being sent, Cargill made a commitment that 100% of all its traded goods would be produced without deforestation. So they will require producers to prove that they have not deforested areas before they will buy the product, whether it's soy or sugar or palm oil or beef or whatever. Those are the kind of leverage impacts that you can begin to see. The only country that has made a similar commitment did it out of a crisis, and this was after 2008 and the sale of horse meat from Ireland that was supposed to be beef. And the government said, this is a reputational issue we do not want to have. And so they made a commitment that 100% of Irish food exports would be third-party certified as sustainable by 2016. They're not going to make it. But they've got about 80% of their beef producers and 80% of their dairy producers already putting data into a common system where they can see what their performance is against key indicators and see how to improve and see how other producers, neighbors, people in the other parts of the country have done better. No other country has done this. It's not perfect. They need more indicators in there. They need to be looking at other things, not just efficiency and productivity, also so things like sustainability, but that's a good start. So for all of these entities, the real thing that they're worried about is risk, and it's a twofold worry. On the one hand, it's about, are there going to be enough raw materials in the future? How can we shift from spot market kind of adversarial relationships with providers to long-term partnerships, long-term contracts? And the other side of the risk is, what is the reputational risk for buying things that you don't know where or how they're produced, that are going to bite you? In an age of social media, where a picture can move around the world in minutes, if you don't know what orangutan was killed because of your palm oil supply, or what forest was decimated inside a national park because of your cocoa supply, you don't care, because it's certainly possible for you to know. So if you don't know and act on it, you don't care. And that's a signal you really don't want to send consumers. Just a bit about some trending. In 1975, the value of the S&P 500 was primarily intangible assets, things like factories and fleets and productive assets, etc. By 2009, the value was in intangibles. It was about brand. It was about reputation. It wasn't about physical assets anymore. And that's why these reputational issues, this is what's pushing moves for traceability, moves for transparency, more than anything else. But here's the issue that's going to trump everything. We've started collecting anecdotal information for the last 3-4 years. We've got about 16 researchers that have pulled together a lot of data. What we have found is that between 5 and 50% of all globally traded commodities are not produced legally in the country of origin, using whatever the laws and regulations are of that country. We're not saying there should be certain laws about X or Y or Z. It's not that. It's what already exists. They're not being enforced across all these commodities. Now, our interest really on the commodity side are these last 3. So we approached a few companies, and they said, look, if we agree with you, this is a big issue. This is their lawyers, their procurement people, their policy people. if we acknowledge this issue, then we're liable. At very least, we're culpable. And we can't fix this. We cannot enforce government laws. We don't even know what they all are in some of these countries. So they said, why don't you, as WF, do research on 8 commodities in 8 geographies and have it a mix of developed and developing countries, put all of the information in the public domain so no company can claim that they're not aware of it. And then let's make this a pre-competitive issue where NGOs and companies can push governments to start enforcing these laws. Now, the 8 commodities that we're looking at are soy and beef from Brazil, palm oil and pulp and paper from Indonesia, cocoa from Cote d'Ivoire, shrimp aquaculture from Thailand, beef from the US, dairy from the Netherlands, and olive oil from Italy. What we found, and the white paper is going to come out in about a week, is that between 10 and 35 to 40% of the globally traded commodities, each just being reported from one country, is not produced legally. If you actually took the top 10 producers of each of the commodities, we think the figure would be much higher. The sources of illegality are different. They vary quite a lot. But this is the reputational risk issue that's going to be on the horizon and really be, the Consumer Goods Forum is taking this up in October at their board meeting in Paris where I'm presenting this data, and they're going to take this on as their next issue. So this is going to be getting a lot of press. The question is, how do you move forward on this? How do you define the 6 or 8 forms of illegality you can work on? Because you can't work on everything. But we think slave labor is a pretty obvious one. We think invasion of national parks is probably a pretty obvious one. So there are some things that we can agree on. But I think the one thing that legal producers and legal buyers, people who are trying to do the right thing, need to be aware of is that this illegality, in all the data we've seen so far, undermines price by at least 15%. So if you're trying to be legal, you're already at a 15% deficit because somebody's underselling you because they're not legal in all these markets. Think about that as an exporter of food. Half to 2/3 of all dairy products are diluted, according to estimates. Imagine what that means for people who are trying to sell actual milk. So I'm from Missouri. We have a saying goes, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. We know where we are headed by 2050. We don't necessarily know how we're going to get there, but we know where we have to get to. So that's the challenge. Think about it. It's technically food waste and loss. So in developing countries, it's mostly post-harvest losses. It's insect, rodent, mildew, storage, lack of infrastructure, lack of cold storage. It's all of those kinds of waste. In most developed countries, we've solved those problems, so it's more shrinkage along the value chain. It's post-consumer waste, it's portion size, it's sell-by dates, it's all of those kind of post-consumer size. All together, it adds up to about 1 in 3 calories. But the sources are very different depending on where you are in the world. All of it can be reduced, though. And one of the things we're doing with in the U.S. is to get the buyers of, say, vegetable crops, which will often default on contracts if they've already purchased enough or if they haven't more than they want, and that is just plowed under. Now we're trying to get them to develop a 2-tier system where they will agree to buy the entire crop. They pay the price that they agreed on for the top tier for what is their real quota, and then they buy the other at a second value price, and they can sell that on to other companies that are looking for that same product, or even to public services that use those products, so that we can reduce waste institutionally by having those kind of mechanisms in contracts. Well, I think certainly in terms of trade, you're in a very good place in the sense that you have comparative advantage to produce things that are wanted on global markets, and you're actually producing them and selling them and taking pressure off of other countries to produce those things. You're a low-cost producer, so you're forcing other people to become more efficient, other countries to be more efficient, and if we can just get rid of some of those subsidies, that'll happen even faster. you're affected by tariffs and trade barriers, like every food producer is in the world in a way, but even more so because a bigger portion of your food is exported. I think you're seen generally as green and as legal, although I would bet if you scratch the surface, you're going to find illegality in New Zealand as well, whether it's about packaging or labeling or all kinds of things. But these are just things that nobody's been looking at yet. And so once you start looking at things, you start seeing things. But in general, I'd say the reputation is good. But I'm not an expert on New Zealand, so really this is, a one-eyed person at best. Well, I think you're going to have to be very transparent about what your products are. And if they're GMOs, then you're going to have to say that. And countries are going to make decisions based on what their values are. So what I said is that we need to be using genetics, not necessarily transgenics, because those are going to be limited in terms of what markets you're going to be able to sell into or even consume those products. But in most markets, it's more about labeling than an absolute prohibition. So you just need to be transparent on that. But there's a lot that can be done that's not transgenics. Most of the big gains in food production are not going to be about transgenics. That's more about traits for resistance and tolerance of pesticide use. The actual productivity things are all coming about from marker-assisted breeding. And that would affect your feed more than your animals. Now, just on this illegality thing, the reason we included Dutch dairy in this is that everybody cares about where the palm oil comes in that ends up in their products, but nobody cares about where the soy comes from that ends up in their animal protein. And if 70% of Brazilian soy is produced illegally, and half of the dairy cows in the Netherlands eat soy from Brazil, then you could argue that half of Dutch milk is tainted by illegality. And even if it's not a legal issue, it's a reputational issue. Now, they've made good moves to get RTRS certified, so they are 100% compliant, but other countries aren't. And we want to use that example to actually just raise that point. And these are not black and white. No, not everybody's going to agree on what is legal or not or how important it is. 50% of agricultural labor in the US is not documented. So that means it's illegal. Does that mean 50% of US production is illegal? And about every 10 or 15 years, we go through and redefine who's legal, and then everybody's legal. And then every year it gets a little bit, and the Netherlands does the exact same thing. Let me answer that in two ways. The first is that today we've got 7.4 billion food experts on the planet. So you're not going to tell anybody what to do. I mean, you're not going to successfully tell them what to do. You can shout a lot. But I think here we have to, consumers should be informed. And that's a journey. That's a lifelong learning process because there's new information coming out all the time. But I think you have to be aware of what the impacts of your choices are. I don't think people are going to stop eating animal protein. But if you choose to eat certain things, you need to understand what the impacts are and how you can think about your life to put it more in balance. And that's an individual choice. I think that's why just a simple slogan like Meatless Mondays or No More Meat or Only Vegetarian or all this, that's just not going to work at a global level with 6,000 different cultures speaking different languages, et cetera. That's not going to be a solution. But getting more informed, voting for food, I think is important because I think that's where a lot of the big food issues and battles are going to be decided going forward. It's about policy. So there are companies that are making commitments around sustainability. And I think, I know it's a kind of odd thing to say, and it's also, if anything, social media has eroded trust in every major institution, except for your circle of friends. But I think that some companies are actually making commitments that mean that all of their products are going to be more sustainable. And you need to start keeping track of that. Which of the companies that are making those commitments, and they're usually time-bound and volume-based. And then how are they doing against the commitments? I think we want to support those kind of companies. And if they don't achieve their goals, like Unilever's not going to achieve their goals, they're going to get 80% of their volume, but they're not going to get 100% of 3,300 different raw materials. So then you got to understand why, and is that acceptable or not, or can you put pressure on them to move further, or yeah, I mean, it's those kinds of things. It's just not simple to be a consumer. As the architect of this strategy at World Wildlife Fund, we kind of decided 10 years ago that governments were asleep at the wheel and that politicians were too busy being elected to actually take seriously a lot of the issues that need to be addressed. And also governments only manage pieces of the planet. And we don't have a planetary system that's really managing much yet. Whereas virtually every company manages a global supply chain. And they have an interest in the long-term access to those resources, maybe not for the same reasons we would, but there is a legitimate thing that they're looking at. So rather than private sector driving this process, I would say they're leading. They're leading out of their own self-interest, and those need to be amplified to the interest of other interests like trees and natural resources and things. But it's a good start. And I think we can learn a lot from what the better producers and better companies are doing to both inform the next 10,000 companies, but also government actions that could help move the bottom. Because whatever the 6 or 8 impacts are on the top end, they're the same thing on the bottom end. And so if we can get producers to start addressing 2 or 3 of those and show continuous improvement, that's already a start. And government can do that through licensing or through pollution issues or whatever. They have the ability to move the bottom that way. So it isn't either or. But I think the real thing that has been missing to date is that it's planetary. We need to start thinking about this as a planetary issue. What are the planetary metrics for sustainable food systems?
So thank you very much, Jason. That was inspiring, confronting, challenging, exciting, all of the things I think we need in order to feel compelled to continue to take action. I'd like to thank you from today's audience and from Business New Zealand. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.